First presenter is Julian Jason Haladyn. He is a professor at OCAD University, which is short for Ontario College of Arts and Design in Canada. And Julian's paper is titled Chantal Akerman in the Time of COVID. Please, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat box during Julian's presentation, and we'll get them after he's done. Okay, so now Julian, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Just warn everybody in advance, I have multiple animals who love making a racket whenever I'm online, apparently. So if you hear any weird noises, that's likely what it is. I'm going to share. Okay, so hello everybody, and I did want to start off by saying thank you to Elizabeth Goodstein for her amazing presentation, which works well in terms of how I will be approaching this particular topic. This topic is actually part of a larger project I did around COVID, and looking at boredom within COVID was part of that, but not a whole lot of it. And this presentation really took off because of a number of things. The first was the renewed interest in Chantal Akerman during the pandemic. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But I wanted to start off talking about the filmmaker's death in October 5th, 2015. It's unfortunate that she apparently committed suicide for various reasons, including her manic depression. And this was a time when I was really doing a lot of research on her, and it affected me a lot. And so it stuck with me quite a bit. And so when the pandemic hit and I started doing research, the fact of her death was still with me quite powerfully. And so I was interested in the way that her film started to be talked about in relation to COVID, the death, and a lot of the social and cultural issues that arose from it. In particular, Jeanne Dielman seemed to be something that was on a lot of people's minds. I read about it probably more during the pandemic than I did before it. A lot of passing references, some more intense ones, mostly because of the fact that so much of the experience of the film itself seemed to mirror what all people were suddenly thrown into the situation, into a situation that was parallel to this. The kind of slowness of life, the confinements, a lot of the issues seemed to raise questions and parallels in people's own lives. And I show here one of the more famous scenes of Jeanne peeling potatoes. And again, for those of you who know the film, you'll already know this, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page, as opposed to a Hollywood film in which we would see her peel, let's say, one or half a potato, and then we cut to the end where she's done, we get to sit and watch her peel all of the potatoes necessary to make the meal. And this is an interesting question of duration. It's not simply an aesthetic choice. It's actually a highly charged decision on the filmmaker's part, because it asks questions of us as an audience, of how we deal with material, how something as simple as editing actually takes out a reality that we all have to live with. So the very first question that I started with was a basic one, which is, what does it mean for a film to change in a specific time? It seemed like the film was different. Watching it again in 2020 and then again in late 2021, the film felt very, very different to me. The texture of it, the way that the plot functions, my ability to engage with it was quite different. And as I said, I wasn't the only person. In terms of talking about how things change, I wanted to bring in a parallel, which has nothing to do with the presentation, but is more just about what it means for something to change. I organized a symposium on Marcel Duchamp, which took place literally days before the shutdown happened for COVID. And the art historian David Hopkins presented on Duchamp's work Paris Air, which contains air from Paris, which happens to be at the same time that the Spanish flu is happening. And so Hopkins is one of the first people to really take that seriously, what it means to capture air at a time when air is not an innocuous thing. Now, when David proposed the topic to me, it was literally close to 2 years before it took place. So he did not have COVID in mind, but you can imagine that literally everybody in the audience, that's all they were thinking. COVID was in the air. We're talking about air. That was what he kept repeating over and over again, that this was not the original intent. So when we talk about a change in context, this can change works radically. And I really want to emphasize this because I don't think we always take the amount that contextual change can change the meaning of a work. So we've been shocked by the power of the virus to throw our societies into chaos, to deprive us of our lives and liberties, and to destroy economies. COVID-19 invites us, calls on us, requires us to rethink who we are and what we value. Among the quotes that I engage with, this one was one of the more powerful because it really spoke to me about how COVID changed the question of value, which again is something that I know Goodstein throughout her work really emphasizes and something that's always been important to me in her writings. Now, what changes in the film? This was the kind of next question that comes in. And Akerman's practice and interests seemed quite apropos for COVID, specifically her exploration of the role of women, of domestic activities and spaces, and her strategic use of slowness or boredom. All of these suddenly changed. They became more significant, but they also became quite different in the way that they're used, the way that they're interpreted, you could say. At the New York screening of Over There, Akerman stated, it's a very contemplative film, and by this I mean slow. And in many ways, we could actually interpret slow as a form of boredom. The point of the film that she's referring to is the way in which it doesn't really do much. She films things and we see them in their duration. Duration and boredom become two interlinked things during the pandemic. And so, very much in line with that, this is a lot of where my research went in terms of looking into this. And so, of all of Akerman's films, Jeanne Dielman most powerfully describes the reality of what we saw and experienced during COVID. And I'm thinking very specifically about the earlier years, 2000, 2001, 2002 a little bit, but the lockdowns, the way that we had to deal with duration in such a direct way, all the way to teaching online, which again was very important in the last panel. And when we look to other writers to see this, because it's not just, I just don't want to say what I felt about the film, but when I say that other people wrote about it, I wanted to bring in a few examples. And this is one in which the quote unquote film for this moment was named by one particular author. After nearly a year and a half of involuntary confinement, of one day monotonously blending into the next, with precious little change, of repeating the same limited routines with no hope of breaking out of the rut anytime soon, this week I finally saw the film that speaks to this moment far more than does any other. Jeanne Dielman does, because this is Jean's life. This is how she lives. She lives in this monotonous routine. And again, for those of us who sit through the 3+ hours of it, you get to experience the duration of that at the very least as an audience member. For the sake of this presentation, I wanted to briefly touch on 3 areas or 3 themes that I thought were important that I wanted to share in this particular presentation. The first is repetitive and domestic labor, the second, care work and sex work, and the third, slowness and boredom. In terms of the repetition and the domestic labor, it's interesting the way that this is represented in the film itself. The domestic activities, again, as I said, are presented in their full duration. We don't get the relief of editing that Hollywood loves to give us. It doesn't take us away from things, but rather forces us to experience the thing in its totality. And again, I really need to stress this is not an innocuous or, very general experience. It's a very specific one that Akerman wants us to have as viewers. As I watch Jeanne Dielman, the affection that Akerman feels for Jean's minute gestures extends to my own tinkering about my apartment, where I attentively carry out small tasks as a way to distract myself from the mounting sense of dread. We see the way that the author here is really, imposing or projecting ideas onto Jeanne, who the actor who plays her is quite spectacular, to say the least. Her lack of affect is quite beautiful in the film. Akerman characterized Jeanne Dielman as a feminist film for a number of reasons. And in one interview or discussion, she says, "Because I give space to things which were never, almost never, shown in that way, like the daily gestures of a woman." But more than the content, it's because of the style. If you choose to show a woman's gestures so precisely, it's because you love them. That's the other reason why I think it's a feminist film, not just what it says, but what is shown and how it's shown. And this, I think, is exactly why it had such an impact during the pandemic, because what is shown and how it's shown spoke to us at that moment, spoke to many viewers at that moment. In terms of the content, the care work and the sex work are, let's say, the most general and the most particular of the film itself. Most of the film consists of Jean doing care work of various kinds, taking care of her somewhat uncaring son, taking care of the household or the family or the domestic, depending on how you want to view it. And then there's the sex work that takes place during the film, which is pretty much as boring as the care work. They seem actually quite linked, which is why I put them in the same category in this particular case. The conception of familial space and domesticity as a sphere of reproduction rather than production makes it all the easier for caring labor to be routinely exploited by the market, whether in the form of unpaid care workers or in the continuing reliance upon women's unpaid labor in the home. This is the Care Collective, the Care Manifesto, which was published during the pandemic and has a lot of overlaps with that kind of moment, you could say. COVID-19 has the potential to be a disaster for equality. I put this very precise, we could say, quote about this because of the fact that this is one of the takeaways from the pandemic is the questions of equality, rather than being helped, maybe we have more visibility. But a lot of the commentators, a lot of the people who are writing about this show that the pandemic led to more inequality than equality, you could say. Amongst the routines that define Jean's daily life, her engagement in sex work must be viewed in a very different light within the current pandemic. If there's one thing that I actually had quite a difficult time with, and the very first time I presented a version of this presentation in a longer form, this was the one thing that everyone asked me a lot about. This was in 2021, I believe. Because of the ways in which I discussed it, a lot of people questioned how I was bringing in the issue of sex work in particular. But for Akerman, the sex work, as I said, is very much a routine like any of the other things that Jeanne does. And as you can see from her facial expression during the sex act, she doesn't exactly seem riveted or excited. And this really isn't erotic by any stretch of the imagination. There's something very mundane about how sex is viewed within the film. And this contrasts or asks questions in relation to the pandemic. Doing even a little bit of research, you open up quite the rabbit hole of problems in relation to sex work and the pandemic. And so rather than talking about it in my own terms, I wanted to bring in the words of a self-identified sex worker who says, I am so lucky many people are still working in person and outside. How is anyone to turn down work to stay inside if they have no savings, no access to financial relief, or no home? And so, one of the things that this area of research really showed was the distinction between different levels of sex work, which Aragon is drawing attention to. She really identifies as kind of a core group of people who need to do the sex work, but at the same time have the luxury of making some decisions for herself. There's also the category of sex workers during the pandemic who, as she notes, had to be in person, had to do whatever because that was their only means of finance. And then the other category, which becomes very important to acknowledge, are, of course, those who are in the sex slave trade, who literally have no decisions and no choice. And Aragon is very good at distinguishing these levels. And I found the other texts that I read during the pandemic, most of them just flattened it into one category of sex work, which is quite disgusting, to be honest, and inappropriate. For Akerman, the sex work is, again, part of the boredom more than anything in the film. It doesn't really do much, it doesn't engage. It's about as exciting as her peeling potatoes. And so while it takes on a new meaning within the pandemic, it also reinforces the question of the slowness and boredom that the film is really centered around. And if there is one thing that this film captures most and that spoke most to the moment during the pandemic, it is the question of boredom. As I said, it's 3+ hours, 3 hours and 45 minutes long. And during it, we witness her engaged in various routines, all of which, again, including the sex work, is presented as mundane and boring. There is no real moment when we see Jeanne Dielman excited or interested or engaged. There's a weird veneer to her appearance, to her affect that, again, I give full credit to the actress who does this, who is quite extraordinary. She presents herself in a way that, again, is there to accomplish tasks. The routine is everything. And again, I think this speaks a lot to many of our experiences of various things during the pandemic. The flattening of everyday life with work was a big key example. I find it weird presenting this online again because this was part of the great problem of, for me, teaching, because teaching online was always this very flat experience where the difference between fiction and reality seemed to be completely elided. And there was a hard time getting engaged. A lot of us talk about getting our students engaged, but I think there's also the side of, as a professor or as a presenter, really feeling the passion of something, when I'm staring at my own presentation. And I love the fact that Elizabeth pointed that out. I don't get to see anybody. I don't see responses right now. All I'm seeing is me talking to my own computer. Boredom is precisely what makes the film, makes it the film of this moment. The way it captures the feeling of involuntary confinement, of one day monotonously bleeding into the next, of repeating the same limited routines. It really speaks to a moment in which boredom took a forefront, much more so than it had before, because it's something that people couldn't avoid anymore. It was something that had to be talked about. And that discussion got tied into, again, the question of duration. The pandemic started asking questions of duration and how we experience it. And I'm thinking here very much of duration, not as a clock time, but as a very psychological sense of what time can be for an individual. I think it's important to address the fact that I am bored. I am, in my bones, bored of this. I know that in the current climate, being bored is a high luxury, but it doesn't make it any more thrilling. and this is still only in 2022, a text on post-boredom, which I found quite humorous. While Jean waits for potatoes to boil, I drag myself from bed to begin preparing dinner. Turnka was a great example. She talked about this film from a very direct, very personal perspective, and I found hers to be one of the more honest accounts in the sense that she couldn't help but talk about the film in relation to herself, maybe projecting herself a little bit more than necessary onto the film, but at that moment, it was exactly what needed to happen. Anything less felt a little bit less real, less honest. And it was something that I greatly appreciated in her text. So I wanted to end with this idea that is really the cornerstone of why I am presenting this material, which is the idea of durational boredom that we see in Jeanne Dielman, which really is part of the very structure of the film. It provides a point of reference within an otherwise overtly fluid sense of life under COVID. And I think there's a lot we can learn from this idea of a durational boredom, not only the analysis of film and other visual works, but I think more generally within boredom studies. So I'm going to exit. Thank you very much. If I can exit. Where am I? Okay. Oh, have I stopped exiting?
Yep. Yeah. So thank you, Julian. And if you have any questions, either please raise your hand or put them in the chat box, and we'll get to it now. If oh, okay. So there's, I think, one long comment. Do you want me to read it, or would you like? Is it better for you to read it?
I'm a slow reader, so if you don't mind,
Okay.
I'll take advantage.
So that was amazing. Tirna Chatterjee says, the personal quality of the felt passage of time, her films attune the viewer to the possibility of wonder and encourage considerations of the embodied representation of profound emotions such as solitude, body politics, alienation, dissociation, and boredom. And we see this deeply realized in slow cinema as an emergent decolonizing movement and a resistance. Akerman quite possibly achieves the politicization of aesthetics instead of cinema's tendency to often aesthetize politics. So politicization of aesthetics versus aestheticizing politics. I guess this is a comment. So would you like to respond?
Yeah, I completely agree. This is the thing that's so amazing about Akerman throughout her entire practice, and this also includes her artistic practice. She does installation video work, which is quite extraordinary, one based on Jeanne Dielman, which I really enjoy. The question of the politics, and especially in relation to her feminist approach, is incredible because of the way that it brings politics back to something that's very core, starting with the body, but taking the body as something that's a little bit different than just an idea of a body, but a body that functions, that exists, that has duration, to use the word, my word of the day, I should say. And again, I know that I keep going on about the peeling of the potatoes, but it's really an amazing thing to actually see an action, not a performance. In the end, I'm hoping they use the potatoes to do something with, because she did manage to peel all the potatoes. It's not just a performance or an act. It is an entirely functional thing. And that's what's so powerful about it. It ties the body to accomplishing something, no matter how mundane that is. And so, yeah, the way that that speaks to a question of politics is something I don't think any of the writers on Akerman have taken as seriously as they could. And I'm hoping that people will eventually.
We have a question from Elizabeth Goodstein. So thanks for the paper. Could you reflect on the relations between duration and depth of boredom? Is this a different axis entirely that suggests the limits of such categorizations?
If I understand the question correctly, I very much in line with your own thinking. I don't know if I would say that I think of boredom in terms of depth, if I'm understanding it correctly, in terms of greater or lesser boredom, but rather in terms of how much it affects either on an individual level or a cultural level. And I think it kind of sways between those two. And so this is why I ended up settling, when I was doing this research, on durational boredom, because duration is something that, again, functions a lot like a bridge. Duration is something that exists both at the individual level and at the cultural level, and it connects the two. And I think for boredom to make that connection, to exist in both realms, it needs to recognize that at certain moments. And I think during the pandemic, Akerman spoke to so many people because it did exactly that. In the end, we're watching one woman who's an actress peeling potatoes, but another woman sitting in her apartment in Montreal could read this and respond to it, act accordingly. And so the boredom speaks on those two levels. And I did find it actually quite funny. And this is an overly generalized statement, so I apologize in advance. But most of the women who wrote about Akerman during the pandemic seemed to respond on a very bodily level, most of the men on a conceptual level. Again, it wasn't 100%, but I did find that a really interesting division, especially given the fact that Jeanne Dielman does require you to understand certain bodily experiences that, again, are only accessible to women, we might say, especially from Akerman's perspective. I feel like I've given a very generalized response. So if you wanted to push me for more clarity, I'm more than happy to clarify. Elizabeth, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking, no, I think it's right. I mean, it's in a way, just at the simplest level, pointing to these phenomenological dimensions of duration and reminding us. I think this is part of what I mean about remembering the experience in the pandemic, that this that extended experience of it's not normal, and yet our awareness of time and the urgency of it all is so intense, right? So the durational boredom is also accompanied with this incredible sense of, right, somehow we're in the midst of this historic experience. And I think you're right that social connection is there. I mean, it points, I think there's other places you could see this, but I think it points to the importance of focusing on the phenomenological as opposed to conceptual definitions. Mm-hmm. Because duration doesn't necessarily mean depth. We think about Emma, right? It went on for so long, and in a way it stayed superficial, and then all of a sudden it went deep. I mean, there's not really a correlation there. They seem to be two sort of different things, even though deep seems like it's also what's the word? A description that's tied to orientation in space, but it's different. It really is different. I don't think it's just the space-time thing. Anyway, sorry, I don't know how helpful that is.
No, it's incredibly helpful. And this is why I wasn't sure if I understood your reference to deep correctly. Because usually with deep, it's, again, the idea of more of a profound or more of a superficial. And I found in the pandemic that absolutely flattened. I mean, your theories around that, I think, were close to proven as far as I was concerned during that moment. As you know, this was, if I was to ask you a question after your presentation, it was going to be on, I wrote a text on COVID boredom, specifically responding to the relationship between boredom and depression, where a number of doctors noted the fact that way too many people were claiming to be depressed by things that they were clearly just bored about, and having to really emphasize that there is a distinct difference. And I don't think that's a difference in depth, that's a difference in category, where an inability to experience happiness or joy is depression, is depression. Just not being able to because you're stuck in your home is boredom. There is a difference. And the way that those two started to collapse, I wrote a short article on it because it was just fascinating to me. And I think your presentation really focused on that exact issue in some ways.
Okay, so thank you for this. Maybe we can circle back after we're done with all the presentations. So